The COVID-19 emergency meant cutting red tape and doing away with some of the rules of public procurement. But at times like this, how do we act fast, but still limit the opportunities for corruption and waste? A new book from the CEPR Press examines recent episodes of public procurement, many during COVID-19, to find out what we can learn. Hello, Erica.
Good morning, Tim.
Giancarlo, hello to you as well.
Hi, good morning.
And Oriana, welcome as well.
Hello.
Yeah. Now, we start. Why the fundamental question at the start of this is, why do we always need rules, and why do we inevitably need some discretion when we're talking about public procurement?
So that is the question, Tim. Public procurement is an interesting case. If you think about it, there is a person who buys goods or services which they will never use themselves with money which is not their own. So I think it's clear why we need rules. Why we need discretion is a bit more subtle. And the discretion angle comes into the picture because the person making the purchase will have better information of where they can find the good at a better price, or whether it's best to wait to buy that good, or whether there is a new version of the good coming into the market that they can buy. So there is a myriad of variables that go into that decision, which cannot all be codified in rules. So it's a matter of keeping the balance between, constraining the behavior of the procurement officers so that they don't just run away with the money, and at the same time leaving them enough freedom so that they can do their job properly.
And of course, Erica, everyone's become aware of this because of COVID-19 and the amount of very visible public procurement that happened at this time. Where have we seen the tension between these two principles?
Well, thank you, Tim. So this natural tension that exists between regulating public procurement while still allowing some discretion to allow essentially for adapting to changing circumstances presents like a trade-off that we see definitely shifted towards more discretion during crisis. And this was because governments were faced with the pressing need to save lives, implement solutions, especially health-related solutions, fast, and resorted to either very streamlined processes or no processes at all. The book, in fact, has a very nice illustration of this, a chapter that surveys 140 countries worldwide and shows what kind of different rules were implemented as a result of the COVID emergency. What we see is that in tipping the scale in favor of discretion, we also naturally have more chances for abuse. This abuse can just take the form of simply higher cost or simply lower quality, and the media, of course, is full of such examples. A company that produced bottles that now makes PPE, ventilators that are procured for many times their value, and so on. But we also have the chance, on top of that, of more fraud, more corruption, more related party transactions. Again, you can see some examples of that in the book. We talk about some of the politically connected firms that suddenly get more contracts. So we see that this discretion in crisis leads to essentially faster processes or no process, and that this, of course, comes at the benefit of being able to provide the services we need in a crisis, but at the cost of being more exposed to risk.
Giancarlo, let's talk a little bit more about that abuse, because that's kind of the public narrative about this, isn't it? Always public procurement leads to some kind of corruption if there is discretion allowed. I see in the book you have some examples for Czech Republic, Italy, that seem to demonstrate this. What tends to be the problem?
Well, yes, the narrative has always been that discretion is bad in public procurement. It has been pushed by episodes of corruption and abuse. But again, public procurement is a tool, like a hammer. So if you bind the arms of your worker, then he will not be able to do anything. If you leave him free, of course, he can abuse his hammer and kill somebody. So you have to find the mix. Now, in the examples we see in the book, actually, we see a lot of, particularly depending on the institution level, and then we will talk about this later, I guess. We find abuses, which there are some empirical results on some countries where they show that the increased discretion has been abused in certain ways. But then there are other cases which are more mixed, like for Italy, there will be mixed results in which, yes, you find sign of higher price because of the urgency, but sometimes it's normal that you want, if you want something better, you want to hire, you typically pay a higher price. So if you want something faster, you typically need to pay a higher price. So it's not always the case that a higher price it's coming from corruption. It's not always the case. There's always a mix of the two. And the solution, unfortunately, cannot be the same. There is no recipe that works for each country because the institutions around the country are different. There is public monitoring, less public monitoring, more data collection, less data collection. To make an example, everybody talks about Italy and the Czech Republic because we collect a lot of data. There are a few countries in Europe that collect a lot of data and do monitoring, and these are Italy, and the Czech Republic. If you look for data on Germany, Sweden, there is zero data. It's not that there is no corruption there; nobody is checking. And of course, data are very important, and so it's complicated because of this mix and cohabitation of abuse and use. Good people will use, but you can't just eliminate completely the tool to avoid that it is abused, because otherwise you don't do anything, right? And that's the complication in finding a recipe for optimizing this problem, or to find the optimal solution.
Yes, Oriana, I noticed that there are quite a few examples in the book as well as where discretion has improved public procurement. Can you give me some examples of those?
Well, I will leave it to the readers to find out what's in the book. Otherwise, I cannot spoil the content of the book. But I can give you an example from a recent paper of mine where we went to a notoriously corrupt country, Pakistan, because in another notoriously corrupt country, Italy, we had found that actually the rules, the cost of the rules imposed, could sum up to a lot more than the cost of corruption. So as Giancarlo said, Italy collects a lot of data. And we use those data with my co-authors, Andrea Pratt and Tommaso Valletti, some 10 years ago now, to compute the loss of efficiency due to having to abide to the rules and compare it to the cost of corruption. And the cost of corruption is enormous, but summing up all the paperwork that you have to do to stick to the rules actually adds up to a lot more. So we decided to go to another notoriously corrupt country, which is Pakistan, and to change experimentally the amount of discretion that procurement officers have. And lo and behold, we found that giving more discretion to the procurement officers decreased prices by 9% while keeping quality unchanged. Now, how do you explain that? Of course, partly because of less paperwork, but also we find that, once you have rules, you need to hire somebody to enforce those rules. And there is no guarantee that the enforcer is less corrupt than the officers themselves. And so we found that indeed the savings were much higher in districts where the monitor, the enforcer, was less efficient, let's put it this way. And we get savings up to 20% in prices. Whereas when the monitor was more efficient, giving autonomy to the procurement officer does not make a difference.
Erica, you've got a whole section in the book on institutions that seem to be particularly important in public procurement. What are we talking about here? What institutions, what kind of strengths, and why is it that that's particularly useful in a crisis?
So one of the interesting findings that we have in the book is that on top of focusing on procurement-specific institutions and regulation to improve procurement outcomes, we should also be looking more broadly towards other legislation that is designed to curb corruption. We have some specific examples of that in the book when it comes to, for example, political disclosures. So this would be all the rules that regulate the requirements for politicians and members of parliament to disclose financial statements, essentially. So what we find is that the two work very well together. So to say that when you have good rules on political disclosures, then you also improve procurement outcomes as a result. And there are many examples of how political disclosures matter. You have some examples coming out of Russia, where you have public officials driving cars that are worth 6 or 7 times their yearly salaries. So it has been a widely known way to tackle corruption. And what we wanted to understand with this book is, does this also help in other areas? And we find that it does. One interesting kind of follow-up question from this is whether, given the importance of these institutions, does that somehow change when emergencies hit? So how do we kind of dynamically optimize these institutions when emergencies hit? And will this in a way mean that there will always be corruption and waste when there is the need to act fast? I think what we find more generally is that there will always be corruption and waste, period, regardless of whether we're trying to act fast or slower, perhaps more so when we act fast. But like Giancarlo was mentioning, discretion does not necessarily always lead to this kind of abuses. One interesting point that I think both Giancarlo and Oriana mentioned in their previous answers is that there is no kind of one-size-fits-all in the institutional design around procurement. And we find this also in some of my own recent research, that even the kind of the capacity of the public sector is very important in their ability to enforce also all of these rules. And I think this point does come up quite clearly in several chapters of the book, that when designing solutions to improve procurement outcomes, we need to keep in mind the country context in which we operate.
Now, to finish off, you make 2 recommendations that are relevant to probably anyone who's doing public procurement here. So I just want to go over those very quickly. First of all, Oriana, your first one is to improve ex-ante regulation. Now, ex-ante COVID, I would imagine many public officials thought they were doing a pretty good job of that. What should they have learned from the COVID experience?
So obviously we cannot foresee every emergency. We cannot foresee the nature of the emergency, but we can foresee the fact that there will be emergencies. So there'll be earthquakes, there'll be pandemics. We don't know when and what will happen, but we need to have systems in place which allow us more flexibility when that's needed. So it is important to have regulations for so-called normal times and make these regulations flexible for special times. And then, of course, it could get to a point where we need to redesign everything. But if the system is very rigid, it will break at the first shock. So the system needs to be nimble to survive.
And finally, Giancarlo, your second recommendation is to improve monitoring of procurement in a crisis. Are we talking now about just investing more in the ways that we monitor already, or are there new mechanisms by which we could do this?
The digital revolution will help us in this, and it has been helping in this situation as well. So we know that we cannot have a recipe that works for all countries in terms of ex-ante regulation, but we need ex-ante regulation that is adaptable, but already predicts, as Oriana said, what to do in this emergency situation. One thing that is common to everything, which is the recipe for everybody, is that we should check what happened ex post. Now, this is not difficult. Some countries have been very innovative in this. For example, I think Ukraine said, well, yes, we are in a COVID situation. You can give the contract without an open auction, but you have to publish it on a public platform first. And if it's not published, it's not valid. Now, publishing a PDF on a platform is not a big effort for anybody. And if you say that if you don't do it, the contract is not valid, everybody must do it. This creates very easy ex post check, and then there will be plenty of researchers or agencies that can take up the task of controlling what happened ex post. So not only it's not a classic lawyers audits of sending auditors in place and checking the books. I'm talking about imposing some degree more of transparency, since we have to relax ex ante rules. We introduce some more ex post transparency requirements that allow to ex post check what really happened in this mess, because every crisis is a mess. But you don't have, you need to do things fast. You cannot just have, cumbersome transparency requirement ex ante. But if you don't have it ex ante, you need to have it ex post, so that people like our fantastic authors in the book can take this data and check what happened. And then what happened, you can see it reading the book.
It's a great book. It challenges a lot of assumptions that many people will have, and there's some excellent ideas in there that I'm sure a lot of people will be taking up. Thank you very much for talking to me about it today. Thank you, Erica.
Thank you, Tim.
Giancarlo.
Thank you for the occasion.
And Oriana.
Thank you.
The book we've been discussing is called Procurement in Focus, Rules, Discretion and Emergencies. And the authors, you've just heard from them, are Oriana Bandiera, Erica Bosio and Giancarlo Spagnolo. You can download it by following this link. It's a free download. Well, thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.